Well, good morning, Faith family. It's good to see you this morning, and it's a nice, chilly, rainy day, but it's good to be in the house of the Lord, isn't it? And to be together. If you have your Bible, you might go to Jonah chapter 2 is where we're going to be at today. If you were here last week, you might remember we began a series in Jonah, and so this week and then 2 more weeks after this, we'll be in the book of Jonah. You might remember that last week we left Jonah in the belly of the fish. And so this week he's going to get out of the belly of the fish. So he's longer than his normal stay was only 3 days, but this week was a whole week for him. Each segment of Jonah's story, or each segment of Jonah's life that we read about, we see the mercy and grace of God throughout the book of Jonah. And in every glimpse or segment of your life, and in every glimpse or segment of my life, we see the mercy and grace of God, don't we? Continually being outstretched to us. When we see it, just as a side note before we look at the passage, if you remember the sailors, they were caught in the storm with Jonah, and they feared for their life, and they even lost some of their goods, and they threw over their cargo that they had. And yet we find that even they were extended grace and mercy, because when Jonah was thrown overboard, they called on the name of the Lord God and made vows to Him and sacrificed to Him. And it says that the storm ceased. And so we see even in the heathen sailors' lives who had been calling on foreign gods and false gods, even God extended mercy and grace to them as they throw Jonah into the sea. Ben Stewart, in teaching about Jonah, he said this, and I believe it's true of us too, that we all have a tendency to resist God's leadership in our lives. And the Bible calls that sin, and we have a tendency. But there's also a reality that God has a tendency to chase us, or to come for us, or to interrupt our situation or our lives, and we call that grace. And so we see the story of grace in Jonah. Jonah chapter 2, it's only 10 short verses, so we'll read the whole chapter this morning. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly. And he said, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and He answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I have cried. If you have another translation, it might say hell. And you heard my voice, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your billows and your waves passed over me. Then I said, I have been cast out of your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The waters surrounded me even to my soul. The deep closed around me. The weeds wrapped around my head. I went down to the moorings of the mountains. The earth with its bars closed behind me forever. Yet you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer went up to you into your holy temple. Those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy. But I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. So the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Jonah prayed. Well, we see prayerlessness in his life earlier when the word of the Lord came to him in chapter 1 in verse 1 and 2. He was prayerless about what to do. There's no record of him praying, saying, God, is this really your will? Instead, we see that he set his resolve to go from the presence of the Lord. And so he didn't pray when the Lord first called him. He didn't pray as he was fleeing. He didn't pray when he was on the ship. He didn't pray when he was asleep. He didn't even pray before he was thrown into the sea. There's no record of him praying when he got thrown into the sea. But after a few days in the belly of the whale, Jonah came to his senses and began to pray. Now some of us, okay, not some of you, some of me are similar to that, right? Sometimes we put off our praying until we reach despair and it seems like there's no hope left, and then all of a sudden it dawns on us, maybe we should pray. You had that experience, have you? I've had that experience too, because sometimes we just get busy going about facing the situations that we have. I read a story about a young farm boy, and he accidentally turned over the wagon of corn on the road in front of another farmer's house. And so the other farmer came out and said, "Hey, Willis," said, "forget your troubles for a little bit and come in and have dinner with us. And then after dinner, I'll come out and help you get your wagon back up and we'll clean up the mess, and just take a break and don't be so distraught about it." He said, "Well, that's mighty nice of you, but I don't think Paul would like that too much." He said, "Oh, come on, son. Come in and have dinner with us. It'll be okay." Okay, but I just don't think Paul's going to like it. So he went in and had a nice dinner with the farmer and his wife. And he said, "Well, I feel a lot better now. And I just know, though, that Paul's going to be real upset." So the farmer said, "Don't be foolish, son." He said, "Well, by the way, where is your dad?" "He's under the wagon." Right? So Paul's going to be real upset. So sometimes we put off doing what is necessary, don't we? Now, okay, my. None of you have ever put off doing what was necessary, have you? We do. Jonah did. Wouldn't it have been better for Jonah to cry out to God when he first realized that he was going down? Wouldn't it have been better for Jonah to cry out to God at any stage before he was in the belly of the whale at the depths of the sea? Of course it would have. He even didn't call on the Lord when the captain came down and said, "Hey, you sleeper, why don't you wake up? Don't you understand the seriousness of the situation?" But in his distress, in his affliction, see, it's the mercy and grace of God that sometimes He sends a storm in our life to cause us to refocus our attention back on Him. Sometimes He allows us to get into a circumstance where we feel like there is no other option, but why would we be that way? But we are. And in his affliction and in his distress, in the mercy and grace of God, in the belly of the fish. Now, I don't know if you've thought too much about the belly of the fish, but the belly of the fish would not be a pleasant place to be. One, it's dark, right? It's dark, and there was no light. Do you think there was light? All the pictures in the kids' things, right? Jonah can see. Most likely, Jonah wasn't seeing anything. He was in the depths of the sea. He said he went down to the foundations of the mountains. He even said that there was weeds. Can you imagine just seaweed wrapped around his neck? And the putrid smell of rotting, decaying fish that would normally be in a fish's belly. It was not a pleasant place that Jonah found himself. Maybe you found yourself in an unpleasant place because you disregarded God's word for your life. It may not have been the belly of a fish, but it may have been a distressful, dark, not good, miserable place. I don't know why it is, but many times we wait till we reach the bottom until we reach out to God. Many people do that. Many times people wait until there seems to be no hope until they reach out to God. In his distress, out of the belly of Sheol or hell, the holding place of the dead, so near death, or maybe even possibly, some people believe, God maybe even resurrected him. But he was in that belly of the whale for 3 days, wrapped in seaweed and rotting stomach contents of a whale or a fish. But he remembered God. He remembered God. He remembered the place of worship, the temple. He remembered that God. Now remember, it says 3 times over in chapter 1 that he was running. He said, "I'm going to flee from the presence of the Lord." And now in the belly of a fish at the depths of the sea, he was thankful that no matter how low he went, no matter how dark it got, that he could never escape the presence or the awareness of God. Aren't you glad for that truth in your life? I'm so glad that even in the depths of the most miserable circumstance that I got myself into, and maybe that you've got yourself into, we're never far away from God being aware of us, and that His presence is ever with us. That's good news, isn't it? Even though Jonah was trying to get away from God, even at the depths of the sea, he could not get away from God. There's a couple of things to remember about Jonah as we think about this passage. Remember this: Jonah was right where God wanted him. He was right where God put him, right? It was God who created the storm. It was God who sent the fish. It was God who caused the fish to swallow him. It was God who put him in the belly of the fish. And even that is an act of grace and an act of mercy. All of that. He was right where God wanted him. Now that may mess with some of our theology a little bit, that everything is all pie and ice cream, right? Because some people think that it's all going to be great all the time, right? But sometimes, especially when we're resisting God's leadership in our life, especially then, God often puts us in a position that's not comfortable. And matter of fact, sometimes is even miserable, isn't it? Have you been there? I've been there a couple times. Well, we won't rehash that whole thing last week. Some people are still wondering about all the maggots, but never mind. But in verse 4 it says, if you weren't here, you can look it up online, listen to the sermon from last week. He said, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. When he came to himself, doesn't it kind of sound a little bit like the prodigal son who ran from the father and finally he came to himself? And when he came to himself, he remembered the temple of the Lord. He remembered in the temple of the Lord there was the mercy seat. He remembered the things of God. He remembered that. So in the depths of his despair, he remembered. And so, remember this: there's no place you're ever going to go that's not going to be, as you're a Christ follower, wherever you are is right where God wanted you to be. Second thing is, there's no place that we can't or should not seek the Lord. There's no place you're ever going to find yourself in life where you should not or cannot begin to reach out to God. Even if you've made a complete mess of it, even if you're in the belly of the fish, even if everything is all messed up, even if you're a stinking rotten mess, because he wasn't he? Even though he was in rebellion, even though he was running from God, even though he hadn't been pursuing God, in the moment when he reached his lowest, it's never wrong for us to reach out to God. It's never wrong for us. There's never a bad time to reach out to God. Hopefully it's before we get to the belly of the whale, right? Or the belly of the fish. We call it a whale. So that's why I keep slipping into that, because in Sunday school, ain't that way we learned it, right? Bible doesn't call it a whale, a fish. So if you want to correct me, I'm saying it's a fish, all right? There's never a wrong time. There's never a wrong circumstance. There's never a place that we reach in our life where we can't reach out to God. And that's not only true of everyone sitting in this room, but it's true of those loved ones that we have too, that are headed down to a ship and headed away from God and headed down to Tarshish. It's true of our friends and family. It's true of our children, isn't it? It's true of our brothers and our sisters. For some of us, it might be true of our parents that are running from God, and you see that they're about to go into the belly of the fish. God's grace extends to the depths of the circumstances that they and we find ourselves in. And the mess is never too much that God can't rescue out of. So that's the second thing to remember about Jonah. The third thing I want you to remember is that just being able to remember is a gift also from God, isn't it? When things come back to your remembrance, it's a gift of God's grace in our life. Maybe you've never wandered from the path. Maybe you've become a Christ follower and you've just stayed true to the path, and your faith has been a steady climb upward to the great heights of maturity and glory in God. But for me and many of us, our paths have been a little bit divergent, right? Anybody ever took a little, let's look at this over here, right? And the path's going this way. To remember where we were and the closeness we had with Christ, even when we wander, is a gift of grace to draw us back to that closeness. And I'm so thankful for that, aren't you? That the absence of sensing His presence with us causes us to look toward Him again. That's grace. He said in verse 4, then I said, in the midst of all of this mess, then I said, I've been cast out of your sight, but I will look again to your temple. And in verse 7 it says, and I remembered the Lord. I remember the Lord. Verse 8 talks about those vain, worthless idols. And some of you heard me say that one time, my very first message I ever preached, when I was asked to preach, was Valentine's Day of 1988, okay? And so I just answered my call to ministry, and a friend of mine pastored a church in Memphis, and he said, we lived about 90 miles. He said, why don't you come down Sunday night and just preach a message, kind of, practice. So now, think about this. It's Valentine's Day. Wouldn't it be a great thing to preach a simple message on love? But I wasn't too smart back then. I'm still not very smart. So I chose this verse to be my very first sermon I ever preached on Valentine's Day of 1988. And you look at that verse now, and I look at it and think, wow, that verse has got a lot there, but for a novice, right? Anyway, and I only had the King James Version. So that's all I could use, right? And so if you read that in the King James Version, it's even harder to understand and even harder to explain, and I made a huge mess of it. But it really says this, that Jonah realized those who are serving idols forsake the mercy of God in their life. And the idols in our lives, like the idols of Jonah's life, his idol was not some little statue. The idol of Jonah's life was himself. His selfishness, his self-focusedness, his feelings toward the Ninevites, his feelings toward God, his resentment toward God's calling in his life. All of that can be summed up in one thing, that Jonah was his idol unto himself. And that's true for a lot of people today, isn't it? And he says, if you have devotion or worship another other than God, you turn away from God's love and God's mercy. Jonah realized he'd been turning away from God's love and God's mercy. And even in his turning away, God was coming after him. And verse 9, but I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. There was a change of heart in his life. He began to be thankful. I will sacrifice. I will pay my vow. God, I will do what you ask me to do if you just get me out, right? Anybody ever said that prayer? Lord, if you just get me out of this mess, I'll never. Anybody else besides me? You know my Ferris wheel story, right? And our little son and I were up on a high Ferris wheel. We got stuck at the top, and I was scared to death, and he was having a big old time. And I was gripping the white knuckles on the thing, and I said, Lord, if you get me off of this, I will never get on another Ferris wheel the rest of my life. And I have never yet gotten on a Ferris wheel again. Even when the grandchildren beg me, Papa, will you ride the Ferris wheel at Shields with us? No, Grammy will do that. I will hold the purse gladly. Do I think God would punish me? Probably not. But it's better not to make a vow than to make a vow and not keep it, right? Anyway, so that's a foolish vow I made. And it's kept me off the Ferris wheels, but I've never went rolling either. Never mind. Okay. He said, I'll pay my vow. And grace happens. At the depths of the sea, in the belly of the fish, grace happens. Because he could not run from the presence of the Lord. Even though he disregarded God's call, even though he disregarded God's assignment, even though he went far in the opposite direction, he could not escape the awareness of God. It says, and the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. A little side note, all the way through Jonah, and we'll probably talk about this in the last chapter again, but just to set a tone for a thought. Have you noticed that throughout Jonah, everything and everyone obeys God quicker than the prophet? The sea, right? The sailors, the fish, right? God just says it and it responds. Jonah, not so much. Anyway, that's another thing. We'll talk about that later, but just let that ruminate. So, grace. And just to remind you, one definition of grace is that one who is superior stoops down to one who can't reach up. So can you just see how God stooped down to reach down to Jonah in the pit of his mess, with seaweed wrapped around him, in despair, in the darkness. And God reached down to Jonah, heard his prayer, and rescued him. I don't know what it would be like to get vomited out of a fish, but I don't think it would be pleasant. Do you think that would be pleasant? I mean, I'm sure he's glad to get out, but I don't think that was a fun experience, getting swallowed in the first place and then getting spewed back out, right? I don't know. I don't think it was. I just picture this kind of this projectile, right? Here I go. Whew. Anyway, never mind. Let's get. Boy, I'm really getting crazy. Grace is when, someone has said, grace is when undeserving people receive from an unobligated giver an unbelievable gift. Grace happened to Jonah. He didn't deserve it, did he? And God was not obligated to rescue him, was he? He could have left him he could have let him drown in the sea. He could have left him in the belly of the fish. So grace is when an undeserving person receives from an unobligated giver an undeserved gift. Undeserving. God's not at all obligated to get us out of the mess that we get ourselves in, is he? But often his grace reaches down to us. And what did it cause in Jonah's life? Thanksgiving and obedience. What should grace cause in our lives? Thanksgiving and obedience. Isn't it a joy to serve the Lord? Isn't it a joy to walk in fellowship with him? Isn't it wonderful to know him? Isn't it wonderful to be a part of what he's doing in this world? It's the greatest thing ever. And in Jonah, it caused thanksgiving and immediate obedience. He did not any longer look for a ship going away from Nineveh. He went to Nineveh. Jonah did not deserve to be rescued. He did not deserve to be invited again. He did not deserve to be invited again to be an instrument in God's hand. I'm so thankful that when we fail, God doesn't say, okay, well, you had a chance. I'll never use you again. It's over for you. Now, we do that to people, don't we? We disqualify people and say, well, they could never do this or they could never be that because you know what they did, right? But aren't you glad that God looks at us and says, you know what? I'm the God of second chances. And I can still use you even though you got seaweed wrapped around you, even though you smell like fish guts, even though you're a mess. He didn't clean himself up before God issued again the assignment, did he? When he was still in fish vomit, God said, I want you to go. And I can just imagine, this is my own interpretation, I don't think Jonah cleaned himself up. I think he went right to the city of Nineveh and started preaching. That's what I think. Because wouldn't that get your attention if a guy walking around with seaweed and stinking like a fish guts? That would get your attention. Who is this crazy guy, right? Okay, well, never mind. Something else to think about. I was moved again this week as I remembered the words of a song. And we haven't sung this song. It's an older one by Clint Brown, and it says, "If not for grace." And it says this, "Where would I be? You only know. I'm glad you see through eyes of love. A hopeless case, an empty place, if not for grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. I once was lost, but now I'm found. A hopeless case, an empty place, if not for grace." Is that true of your life? And the little refrain goes this, "I know you could have walked away, but you stayed 1,000 times." Aren't you glad he didn't walk away from you? Unless you're one of those that has been steadily climbing on the rainbow of glory. Aren't you glad that he's extended grace? So grace happened to Jonah. Grace still happens to us. Jonah was a mess. He got vomited out onto dry land. That was a gift from God too. He didn't have to swim. God allows U-turns. Think for a moment of some of your U-turns. Think for a moment of some of those things that you were going one way and all of a sudden you realized you were going away from God's will for your life. And you U-turned. Aren't you excited and glad that God allows U-turns? I'm glad he does. Because I've taken some divergent paths before. You know, like the little kid on Family Circus, right? You've seen those, right? He goes all over the place to get the trash over there. But never mind. You have to look that up yourself if you don't know what that reference is. Sometimes you date yourself by using certain references. Jonah Goes. Look at chapter 3. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time. That's significant. He came again the second time and saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you." So Jonah rose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city, a 3-day journey in extent. And Jonah began to enter the city on the first day's walk. Then he cried out and said, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown." Jonah goes immediately. The first time when the word of the Lord comes to him in chapter 1, it says the word of the Lord came to Jonah and Jonah arose and fled. This time it says the word of the Lord came to Jonah and Jonah got up and went. And it said he got to the city in 1 day's journey, and the city was so large it was 3 days if you were going to go around the whole city of Nineveh. It was a large place. And I believe he went in there with stinking seaweed around his neck and smelling like a fish and began to cry out, "Repent, or God's going to destroy you." So as we finish today, I want us to think about a couple of things. You may be here today and your life may be a mess. You may have been running from God, His salvation. The greatest call we'll ever receive is the call of God to receive Jesus as our Savior. And yet, it's such a wonderful gift to us, and yet we find ourselves as humans resisting that. I don't understand it. From this side, I don't understand it. But we do, don't we? So if you're here today and you've been resisting God's call to salvation or some other area of your life, and your life is a mess, it's a good time to call upon the name of the Lord. Just cry out, help me, save me, rescue me. Many of you know the story of John Newton, who was the man who wrote Amazing Grace. And many of you have probably heard at least tidbits of his story. He was alive in like the 1700s, so it's a long time ago, and Amazing Grace is still one of the hymns. We're going to sing it at the end of service today. That is still sung all across the world by Christians. And if you remember the story of John Newton, his mother was a praying woman who was a Christian, and she died, I think, when he was 11 years old, and so he was raised by a seafaring man. He became a sailor himself, and sailors are known to be profane, right? You ever heard the saying he cusses like a sailor? Well, John Newton, the writer of Amazing Grace, could not only cuss like a sailor, but he was known as the great blasphemer. That he could put all other sailors to shame with his vocabulary of profanity. He caused other people to live in debauchery and sexual immorality and all kinds of things in the slave trade. He was so despised that he got kicked off of a slave ship and he ended up on an island and he became a slave himself for a season until he was rescued. But he was caught in a great storm, and the ship was in a storm for 11 days, and it was so bad that the only way they thought they could survive was to keep pumping the water out. And he got so tired he couldn't pump anymore, so they tied him to the helm, just trying to keep him to. And in the midst of that storm, when he was tied to the ship's steering, he remembered his mother's prayers. And he remembered some Bible verses. And he began after that, when the storm ceased and they were saved, he began to study the New Testament and the words of Jesus. And his mother had prayed that he would become a pastor. But he was a slave trader. His life was a total mess. It took a little time, but he became a pastor. He served the Lord in a pastorate, I believe it says, for 42 years. And he wrote the great hymn we know as Amazing Grace. And he helped to abolish slavery in England. If God can rescue Jonah out of the belly of a fish, and if God can take a profane, immoral slave trader and cause him to be a pastor, then surely there's hope for your life, and surely there's hope for my life, and surely there's hope for all the people we know's life. God can take a blasphemer, a profane person, and cause them to speak blessing. He can cause a liar to become a truth teller. He can cause an addict to become clean. He can still do those things, and he still does. He can cause a rebellious person to become obedient to him. He can cause somebody who's sexually immoral to become pure in their relationships. There's hope for people. There's hope for our lives because God is gracious. So even if your life's a mess, reach out to God. Give thanksgiving. When you remember where God has brought you from, give thanksgiving. And if God's invited you to be a part of His kingdom work, get up and go. Get busy doing it. Let's stand and sing this wonderful song, Amazing Grace. Last week we left with Jonah in the belly of the fish. This week we leave him on mission. Isn't that great? What a transformation. It's great worshiping with you today. Remember, everywhere you go this week, to share the love of Jesus. Because everywhere you go this week, someone needs the love of Jesus. And they might even live in your house with you. God bless y'all. There's coffee and some refreshments. Help yourself.